Welcome to A Case of the Mondays, a podcast by 3R Strategy. We are a pay and reward consultancy supporting organisations of all sizes and sectors to take a fair and equitable approach to pay, communicated clearly and honestly to employees. In this podcast, we invite experts to discuss some of the most pressing issues in the world of HR, culture and leadership. We're keen to explore how we can all work to overcome and navigate these challenges. So, tune in to explore how you could create an environment where people don't just have to come to work, but want to.
I'm Rameez Kaleem, your host, and in today's podcast episode, we're discussing how to make the world of work more inclusive and equitable through flexible work. My guest today is Ursula, co-founder of the Inclusive Workplace and Innovation in Equity. Both organizations exist to make the world of work more inclusive and equitable for everyone by supporting companies to close pay gaps, embrace flexible working, and ensure everyone can progress equally in their careers. Welcome to the podcast, Ursula.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here, Rameez.
Yes, great to see you. So the first time that we met was quite a few years ago now, and I can't remember exactly how we connected. I don't know if you remember.
I think it was LinkedIn.
Okay.
Good old LinkedIn.
Yeah, probably, yeah. And so I had just set up 3R Strategy at the time, and so I was just working on my own and trying to figure out how to run a business. And you founded an organization called Mumbelievable. And I thought it was really interesting because I hadn't come across anything like that before. And we just met up and we talked about our prospective businesses and what our plans were. And as with anything, I think a lot of things changed since we set up our businesses back then. But could you talk through that business, Mumbelievable, how that came about? Why did you set that up, and what led you from there to now your current roles and looking at inclusivity in the workplace?
Of course, thank you. So I had found myself in quite a difficult position, really. My career was going really well. I was in communications and felt like my career was just getting started, really. I was sort of just turned 30, really excited about where my career would go. And at that time, I was recovering from some quite significant mental health issues. So I'd established my recovery from anorexia. And part of the motivation for my recovery was to be well enough to have a family. So I'd become well enough to fall pregnant, which was, something that I was really grateful for. Had a baby. He was premature, so required lots of care. And, the first year of his life was really challenging. And at the same time, my husband started to experience some very significant health challenges, and his kidneys failed and he needed a transplant. So within a very short space of time, my life circumstances changed quite significantly. And at that point, it became really clear to me that committing to my career in the way that I always had done was not going to be possible moving forward. So it hit me that, there must be lots and lots of people. Back then I was thinking there must be lots and lots of people like me who, life has happened to and are now wondering, how on earth am I going to make this work? So committing to, work in the traditional sense of, I'd been used to Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, long hours, it just didn't feel like it was possible for me anymore. And I still felt like I had, like I said, I was just getting started. I had a lot to give. I had a lot of potential that was untapped, and it just felt like there was no place for me in the working world anymore. And that led to a bit of an identity crisis. There was a lot of change in my life anyway. So I decided to establish Mumbelievable as a way of supporting people who found themselves in similar circumstances to myself, and helping them to navigate that same challenge, thinking that, there's strength in numbers. And because there were so many people experiencing that same challenge, that there must be something that I could do that was constructive to support those people. So it began with, I teamed up with a coaching company, and we began to go into organisations, primarily through parent and carer networks initially, to support parents and carers with the juggle of life and work. And quite quickly, the organisations that we were working with started saying, well, it's great that we're providing this opportunity for our people to have this conversation and, giving them tips on how to make it easier. But actually, what are other organisations doing? So I started informally advising those organisations of what was happening in other companies that they could perhaps consider implementing for their people. Flexible working being one of those things. And it dawned on me that actually my time would be better spent and the expertise I was gaining would be more valuable if I supported organisations to change. And that's the point we met, was when I switched the focus of the business to a consultancy to help companies to embrace flexible ways of working, to become more inclusive, and to use that as a lever to be able to make it possible for more people to stay at work. And then what happened quite soon after that was I was doing a lot of speaking, and one of the events that I spoke at was Flexpo, and I joined the advisory board for Flexpo, and the team asked me to sort of share what I was learning within the organisations I was working with, to inform the content for Flexpo for that first conference. And that was the aim of that conference initially, was to connect people looking for flexible work with progressive organisations who were offering work outside of the traditional 9 to 5 Monday to Friday structure. So, and what was very interesting about that first event back in 2018 was that I think it was definitely majority, of visitors wanting to come to that event were actually not candidates looking for flexible work. They were HR professionals and D&I professionals hoping that it would be an event where they could find out how to create that culture. So we, at that point, we decided that I would make my role sort of more formal with Flexpo, and we decided to join our businesses together and create a sister event, which was originally called Flexpo Business, designed to meet that need. And then COVID happened, so that need increased exponentially. And we still consult, we still work with 90% of my time is spent within organisations on initiatives to, as you said at the start, to close pay gaps, make work more equitable, and dismantle those structural barriers that exist that prevent people like I was all those years ago from being able to access well-paid, meaningful, good quality work. So coming quickly to the present day, after COVID, as we emerged from COVID, it became really clear to us that this was about so much more than flexible working, and people leaders were really evolving their focus on well-being and employee experience, and flexible working was one of the pillars of an inclusive workplace, but it was just one big piece of a very complex puzzle. And we found that people wanted to get involved with our events and our community, who were talking about employee experience. They were talking about innovation. They were talking about communication tools that would support inclusivity. They were talking about the evolving role of employee resource groups and the developing strategic place for HR and diversity and inclusion in an organisation's success. So we decided to rebrand to the Inclusive Workplace so that it became so much more about than flexible working. And now the company is really all about every aspect of what it takes to make an inclusive environment for everyone, so that everyone can belong.
Okay.
To talk very quickly about innovation and equity as well. So I set up Innovation and Equity with a colleague, Dagmar Albers, last year. Dagmar and I worked together through the other business when she was the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion lead at Pfizer UK. And together we delivered her strategy to close the gender pay gap at Pfizer over 4 years, and it halved in that time. So it's something we're very proud of. And she left last year, and we thought, we can't leave it there. We can't just not do anything anymore, together. So we set up a collaboration so that we could continue the work that we did at Pfizer, and take inspiration from that, and work with organisations to develop career support programs to make sure that everyone has equal access to promotion and opportunity. So that's me.
Okay, so the innovation and equity work is does that involve a lot of sort of looking at gender pay gaps and identifying why that exists and coming up with ways to, because you can have, because one of the things that we often come across is the difference between gender pay gap and equal pay, and we know that some organizations can have a large gender pay gap, but actually no pay inequity, because they're making sure that there's fair pay practices applied across. But you can have an organization that has no gender pay gap, but a lot of pay inequity, because just a handful of roles like a CEO role can sort of suddenly shift your gender pay gap significantly, but the other 99% of employees are not getting that equity. So is that part of your work, do you dig into the gender pay gap and see why it exists, and what are can you give an example of the sort of thing that you work with organizations on to help look at their gender pay gap?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good point. I think there's still such a misunderstanding and misperception around what the gender pay gap actually is versus equal pay. And a lot of people conflate the two things, don't they? I don't know if you find the same in your
Yeah,
work.
no,
But
definitely it is.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's still really persistent. So the gender pay gap exists when there is a gap in the average pay of men and the average pay of women across an organisation, across all levels. So what we do is we would analyse the different roles within an organisation and who is occupying those roles. So it's not that those people are being paid a different salary for doing the same role. That's an equal pay issue, as you've said. But it's really where there's potentially some structural barriers or structural inequities that exist, to mean that there are more of one gender occupying more roles within certain levels of the organisation. So, for example, at entry level, you may have disproportionate numbers of women in more junior positions, and you may have more male employees occupying the more senior roles. And one of the reasons for that is it's a very complex picture, and it is different across every organisation, of course. But one of the driving factors behind that gender pay gap can often be that it is not always possible for people to work flexibly as they progress through the organisation. So in organisations where flexibility is really well established and everyone, regardless of their role, is able to work flexibly in some ways. And I'll come on to what flexibility we mean in a second, because I quite often find there's myths and misperceptions around that in a moment. So I think that's worth coming back to. So where it's possible for people to work flexibly, it's easier for them to progress. And for women in particular, who still societally take the role of primary caregiver, that can sometimes be a barrier to their career progression if they're not able to work flexibly to accommodate their caring responsibilities.
Okay. I mean, that's interesting because, one of the ways that you could look, if you were just doing, for example, some desk research on organizations at flexible working, is part-time versus full-time workers. And because we do a lot of work around equal pay or even gender pay gap reporting, and you can see sometimes there are a lot of part-time workers at entry-level roles, call centers, admin roles. But as you go into more senior roles in an organization, there are very few people that are working part-time, whether that's they're not able to work part-time, or there's an expectation that if you are senior in the organization, you need to be available all the time. So do you think that there is that culture, whether, and if is that right, that if you are a senior manager, if you're a director, that they do need to be available more than the 9 to 5? So yes, you can work flexibly, but people are expected to be doing more than their regular hours and be available to answer things if an urgent query comes up in the evening, or sometimes even weekends. And I know, I mean, we don't have that culture, so we don't, I've never messaged anyone on a weekend in like 8 years, but I know that this is an expectation in some organizations. So do you find that is the case, that progression up the organization means that you are required to make a sacrifice on your personal life against giving more time to the business?
So this is such an interesting question, because we are very privileged in that we get to work with organisations who recognise that this is an issue and want to change it and want to do better. So we quite often find that there is a great deal of humanity and a great deal of understanding and empathy from leaders who have the same expectation as you, that people's precious free time is their free time, and there is no expectation for people to engage with work outside of their working hours. But within those organisations, quite often we find that there are microcultures within teams, and it is dependent on the team manager as to what the culture is. So the other thing that's worth mentioning here, I think, is the assumptions that people make, because what we also find is that there is a disparity between the assumptions that colleagues within a team will make about what is expected of them, and if they then were to talk about those assumptions openly within either within their team or within the wider business, they would actually find that the expectation for them to work outside of their working hours isn't there as much as they think it is. And if they were to say, I'll come back to you when I'm working, that would be entirely acceptable. I think it depends on so many factors. It depends on your parenting, your messaging around work that you had. It depends around your education, where you worked in the early stages of your career, what cultures you were within, and whether you apply those assumptions and expectations to your thinking when you move around into different organizations. So yeah, there's probably not one answer to that question. It definitely exists, the expectation for people to be available all the time and online when the person who's asking you for something is. It definitely does exist. But yeah, what we see more of is the intention from leaders to prioritise colleague well-being and for them to have that safeguarded, boundaried time where they are switching off and able to therefore restore their energy and give more to themselves at work.
Okay, well, I mean, that's good that you and I think that's always nice to have organizations that you work with that have the right priorities. We One of the things that we find is, and you just said that within the same organization, it depends very much on the team. So in one team, it might be very different to another, and that tends to unfortunately happen a lot. So our work is all around pay, and you might have that in one team, pay is being managed in a consistent way, another team it's not. One manager is good at talking about pay to their employees, somebody else isn't. And part of the reason for this is our last episode on the podcast was around leadership, and one of the things that was mentioned was around this concept of accidental leaders, where people are not looking to become leaders, but that's the only way that they see progression within their career. And so they end up in this position, and they find themselves now having to lead. And so some people are just not good at managing, or it's not a priority for them because they just want to get to their day job. So do you find that is a big challenge, that because some people are not really trained in how to support their teams and let them work flexibly, because maybe flexibility doesn't work for them? Maybe they don't have a family and they're thinking, well, why can't everybody else be this accommodating? And what would your advice to be to those organizations? How can you provide more consistent training across the organization?
Again, I think you've touched on something really important, and actually this issue is one of the big reasons why so many organizations are struggling to make flexibility work, because not just managers, but many people, many colleagues are not equipped with the skills they need to have open and meaningful conversations. And they are not equipped to communicate in a way which doesn't rely on presenteeism. So traditionally, if you're the perception was that if you're being able to be seen, if you're visible, you're working. And we all know that's not the case. We've all worked with people who were present but not really being that productive. And so what hasn't happened, this is what we've seen since COVID and the accelerated adoption of more widespread flexibility, especially in terms of location and the rise of hybrid working. What we've seen is that there has been, in some organisations, there has been some guidance and training and time and effort and resources devoted to upskilling managers to be able to have those conversations with people. But there's also been a huge number of organisations who've changed their policy. They might have issued some guidance around what flexibility looks like and what's possible, but they then haven't cascaded that down with a program to upskill those managers. And I think that's where there are enormous gaps still. And it's really difficult, because if you think about how much our societal culture has changed around openness and open conversations, even in the last 5 years, not everyone, was raised in organisations or was raised in environments and an educational environment where it was possible to have open conversations. So it's a very specific set of skills that all colleagues need, not just managers. I think there is a huge amount of pressure placed on managers to make this work, isn't there? Like you say, when they've got a day job to do in addition to managing a team of people who are different from them, maybe. And it's so interesting watching this issue evolve, because to us, the answers are very straightforward in that we need to work on trust. So that's something that we advise organisations to do, and teams to do, to work on communication. And if you talk to teams and they all agree that's important, but when you say, okay, so how are we going to do this? They don't have the answers. And that's the key for us. And so what we've done many times in hundreds of teams is helped the team have that conversation, and then given them a tool, like a process to have that conversation ongoing, so that they can agree ways of working, they can look at what they need to deliver, what their roles are, so that for their team they can agree what will work, what they all need to make it work, what the risks are, what the interdependencies are, and then how they're going to move forward. So that charter process has proved that there is no silver bullet to make flexible working work, of course, but that is about as close as we've found in the last 5 years, because it gives people a structure when, if you ask them to have a conversation about flexible working or have an open conversation with their team, it's too broad, much too broad an ask.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, there are so many issues in the workplace that come from not having open conversations, and we do this as well. We have a training that is specifically designed around how to have pay conversations, because it's another thing that really gets avoided in the workplace. And then eventually, when you don't have these conversations, you make assumptions and you start to resent colleagues or your managers, and that's what leads to the bad culture. But with the challenges around managers not necessarily having the skills or always having these open conversations, what role do you think organizations can play in building the right culture, or a culture that says that it is that flexible working should be accepted, and it will help us be successful? So what would you recommend from an organizational perspective to say, we recognize the manager challenge, but this is what you can do to help make things easier?
So I think the messaging, first of all, it can't work if it doesn't come from the top. So what we see so often is organisations that have said, we've got this policy, we've said this is our approach to flexible working, and here's the support for everybody to make it happen in terms of guidance or training or whatever the approach might be. But then you don't have leadership commitment. You don't have leaders working flexibly in an open way. And when you don't have that, and all you see as a person working within that organisation is leaders working all hours, always present. You know, that it doesn't give you that virtual permission slip that you need to be able to work flexibly yourself. So it's a really, really important piece of this puzzle for every leader to openly work flexibly and to talk about how they work flexibly, because what that does is normalize all reasons for working flexibly. Because in some organizations I've worked with where they will say, well, I can't work flexibly because I don't have kids, or I can't work flexibly because of whatever reason. And one thing that we always say is so incredibly important is that all reasons for working flexibly are equally valid. So whether it's that you do a school run, whether it's that you're looking after a relative, or you've just got a puppy, or you're training for a triathlon, or you want to go to a yoga class, whatever it might be, it's important. It matters to you. And I think that is, if you can get at a senior leadership level, many different reasons why people work flexibly, it normalizes the fact that flexible working is just another thing that we do. It's not a problem we need to solve. It's just a way of life within our business, because we recognize that life isn't linear, and sometimes we will all need to work flexibly, whether that's informally for an afternoon, or formally because we've just been diagnosed with a chronic health condition that we need to manage. So that's the biggest thing. Because when that is happening, as I say, it gives people that psychological safety to be able to play with different working arrangements, because they not only have the policy framework and the guidance, but they also have that permission from leaders.
And do you find that the conversations that you have with leaders around flexible working, trying to convince them of the benefit of this, that they should be implementing this, have those conversations changed significantly since the pandemic?
Yeah, they have, massively.
Are they a lot easier now?
They are a lot easier in many cases, yes. In some cases, there are lots of leaders who are still grappling with this. And that's obvious because there's so much inconsistency around. This company's just ordered everybody back to the office. This company's just made everything fully flexible. So what you're seeing is two polar opposite approaches, and there's no one size fits all. And I think that's because that is never going to change. That's really tricky for organizations, and across different sectors, especially where you've got diverse workforce populations of some people who are in office-based roles and some people who are in frontline or operational roles. It's really difficult for leaders in some cases, because there's another conflation that happens where leaders can confuse equity with equality. And so what we always talk about is that you don't need to offer the same thing for everyone, because sometimes leaders are like, well, if I can't offer remote or hybrid working, which is what everybody wants, I can't offer that to everybody because I've got shops or I've got clinical teams. It's not about offering the same thing to everyone, because flexibility means something different to everyone. For some people, it might be not having to manage the commute in the morning. So, a flexible start and finish time. It could be a 9-day fortnight. It could be working a 4-day week. It could be, taking a break at a different time to the conventional lunchtime during the day because there's something happening that this person wants to do. It is something different for everyone. And I think because of that, and there is no one size fits all, that's overwhelming. Going back to the point we made earlier about, managers not always having the skills to have those conversations, doing something different for everyone is not conventionally, like in the traditional world of work, that didn't happen. So it can feel overwhelming, I think, sometimes. And also there's a concern about fairness, and a concern about the challenge of saying yes to one arrangement for one employee and doing something different for another. So from a kind of policy and procedure standpoint, there is a lot of nervousness around that. So I think It's so different from organisation to organisation, but we do see a lot of progress in the willingness to experiment, and that's something that we've championed for many, many years. That just the opportunity to test different ways of working, see what suits the business, and listen to your people and gather their feedback. They are the best people to tell you what will work and what won't work. And it's more of a collaboration then. It takes the pressure off of any one person or any one team to have the answers. So that, yeah, it's something that lots of organizations are still experimenting with and changing.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of HR people, and we've come across this as well, sometimes struggle with convincing their senior leaders and their CEOs around the flexible working arrangements. And you touched upon this briefly when you were just talking about this, the aspect that not everyone is able to get that same level of flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
And you hear of CEOs saying this, and famously Elon Musk said this as well. Although I don't think anyone should be taking advice from him on working arrangements, but he, it's just the thing around. Well, some of my my roles are required to come into the office. They have to be traveling, and they're not able to work from home. So why should I be unfair and allow half of my employees to work from home when the other half don't have that opportunity? So if you have a CEO that is saying something like this, how would you try and convince them that, well, it's not about, like you said, treating everyone the same way, but how do you try and give something to all of your employees that is going to feel fair to them, and not leave half of your employees thinking, well, why are they allowed to do this and I don't?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I think openness from leadership is really important here, because if you whatever approach you decide on, what we see time and time again in the organizations that are driving great engagement levels and have a fantastic culture, they're able to stand up and say, well, we can't do this and here's why, but what we can do is this. Well, here's what we've decided as a leadership team is fair, and will accommodate the needs of everybody. And one of the things that we would always advocate is, if there are roles which cannot be done in the form of flexibility that the people within that team would like, ideally. So, for example, if you have, just trying to think of some examples that we've worked with. So you might have a team of people working in retail, and they are on the shop floor. So they're obviously not able to work from home. But if you look at that role, there's an element of that role which is administrative. And they might spend a few hours a week writing a report. But we were able to say, well, for half a day a week, this team could work from home if they did all of that administrative work together at the same time. So looking at job design is really important, because that there could be more flexibility than you realise if the job was slightly rejigged a little bit. So that's the first point. The second thing is that within the roles that are not able to be done in a remote or hybrid way, if that's the form of flexibility that team would ideally like, could you add to their development plan working on the skills that they need to move around internally to get the flexibility that they need? So over 2 years, they could acquire the skills that they need to be able to move into a different department so that they can work more flexibly, for example, so we can retain you because you're a great asset to our organisation. So it's not just about saying yes to this and no to this. It's more nuanced than that. I think if you can say that we're looking at job design, we're looking at how we can move people around and increase our internal mobility to make sure that people's needs are met long term, not just short term. But also that we can do this for these teams, and in these teams or in these roles, here's the flexibility that we can offer. So as I said, I've touched on a few, staggered days or start and finish times, or changing shift times, self-rostering, so self-allocation of shift times is an absolute game changer in teams where they're not able to work flexibly because they have more autonomy. And I think that's what we're trying to give people, isn't it? Is choice and autonomy. And if we can do that in different ways, openly communicating the reasons behind that leadership decision making, then that all contributes to that culture that we want to see, which is open, trusting, great communication.
Now, thanks. I think that's really practical and useful advice that I think a lot of us and HR professionals could use to try and convince some of the leaders. That I think it often feels like they're trying to come up with excuses on why not to do something, and using this as a way, well, this is not fair, that's why I don't want to do this, rather than I don't want to do this because I don't value flexibility. Have you worked with any organizations that have in recent months or last couple of years started to mandate the return to office policy?
Yeah, all of them actually.
Okay. So how has that
yes.
been, and how have you found those conversations where, essentially what they're doing is reducing flexibility for a lot of their employees? So how have those conversations taken place? Have you managed to convince any of them that no, this is a bad idea? Or what do you think is the, there are lots of theories around the motivations behind this, and real estate is one of them. But what, in your experience, is the motivation behind this, and have you managed to change anyone's mind?
So my intention hasn't really been to change people's minds, because I have to trust, if I'm working with them, that they know best for their organisation, and my job is to support and enable that culture shift and make things more equitable for everybody. So it's a really interesting one, because in the companies that we've worked with since we emerged from the pandemic and it became possible to bring people back, the primary motivation has been for people to work together, to be able to collaborate, to be able to generate ideas and ignite that creativity, which so many people felt was missing when we were just, during COVID, and when it wasn't possible for offices to be open. So when I say all of the companies that we've worked with that have mandated a return to office, it's not been a full-time return to office. So they haven't done away with flexibility. They have changed the flexibility that they offer so that it's possible for teams to come together and to have that, so the benefit of that social engagement and be able to experience work in a different way. And what they've found is, generally speaking, there's a few exceptions and I'll touch on those in a second, but generally speaking, that has contributed positively to their retention and to their engagement scores, because those companies have managed it in a way which is in consultation with their employees. So it hasn't been a mandate as such. It's been a consultation period where they've said, right, we're coming out of COVID now, and we want to know how your expectations have changed, how you want to move forward, so that we can all figure out an approach which works for lots of people within this organisation. We know we're not going to get it right for everybody, but what we will do is we'll try and develop an approach which is reflective of people's changing needs and expectations. So when they've taken that approach, the opportunities that people have had to feed into that has been a really positive exercise. And then obviously to show that as a leadership team, we've listened to what you've told us, and here's how we've done that, and here's how we've developed the approach. In companies where it hasn't worked very well and the engagement scores have, been impacted negatively, it's because they didn't do that asking. They didn't listen to what their employees wanted. There was a closed doors discussion around what we as a leadership team think should happen. And then it was kind of presented as this is the expectation, is that you are now going to be returning to the office 2 or 3 days a week, whatever it is. And people don't feel valued as a result of that, because it felt like taking away the flexibility that they'd gained through that period. Back to those other companies that had managed it really well. they also monitor it regularly. So they're very open to the idea that this might not work all the time. We've got to be much more flexible and agile as an organisation in a post-COVID world. Things, in many ways, the economy is completely different, and we need to respond and react to that and become more agile. And they have looked at whether, on an ongoing basis, it's working for that approach to be continued. And they've taken the approach of making the office or the location a magnet and not a mandate. So it's how can we look at making experiences that are valuable and add to the employee experience and make our organisation more successful in the process. So it's not things like, lunch and all of that kind of thing, and a pool table. That's in the past. It's meaningful experiences for colleagues to connect and do some great work together, inspire each other, kick off projects, whatever it might be. There's so much value in humans being together. We're a social species. And so when organizations have approached it in that way, it's been much more successful rather than being told you're having to come back to the office. And, I've seen some pretty questionable communications around that, let's just say. And that has a very detrimental impact on retention and on organizational success. So that's very clear.
Okay. So, you're saying that you don't convince them to, or you don't try and change their mind. But deep down, is it a little frustrating that you're seeing? So maybe they're listening, maybe they're not, but you can tell me.
It is, and thank you for asking my honest opinion. I'll be completely honest with you. My intention in doing this work is to make flexibility possible for more people so that more people can stay and progress at work, right? And when I have lots of people contact me within organizations that I'm working with, and they will let me know what it's really like for them. And the leadership messaging and the policy and the framework and all of that kind of stuff is often quite different to the lived experience of employees. And so I see it as part of my role to advocate for those employees and act in the interests of the business. So from a personal standpoint, it is frustrating what is frustrating is when you've shared reams and reams of evidence and you've said, let's just try this. And there's a refusal to experiment. That's frustrating. And that has happened. And I have walked away from projects because it was very clear that what we were doing was a tick box exercise. And I'm doing this work for impact, not to tick any boxes. That's frustrating, yes. But that is rare. That is rare in my experience.
Okay. There's also, I guess, the there's the perception of we're doing something versus the reality of what employees really think, which we see a lot of times when I remember we were running a session with a leadership team, and because this is a question we always ask around transparency, around pay, and said, well, how transparent are you? And said, oh, we're completely transparent. And we thought, well, oh, wow, that's great. But so do you have salary ranges? And I said, no, we don't have ranges. Okay, so do employees know what their pay progression is? And no, they didn't. But and so we asked a number of questions. We realized there was actually no transparency. But from their perception, well, people know when their annual peer review takes place, and it's on the 1st of April, and they know what their increase is going to be. So that's complete transparency. And I'm guessing that you come across the same, where some leadership teams or CEOs might think, well, we have a lot of flexibility in our organization. But when you start to speak to employees or you dig into it, you realize that actually there's very little flexibility. And again, as an example, this is literally 3 weeks before the pandemic. was having a conversation with the leadership team, and we were asking them about flexibility as part of our reward project.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, "Oh, we have a lot of flexibility." And it turned out that employees could put in a request so that they can work from, if it gets approved, they can work from 9:30 to 5:30 instead of 9 to 5.
Okay.
And all of that changed completely after the pandemic. So how would you go into an organization, and do you have like an audit that you might do to say, we've looked at your flexibility, and do you speak to employees? Do you do an employee survey? How do you audit an organization to say, we think you have very little flexibility, or there's a lot of room for improvement?
Yeah, we have it's our flexible model to assess where an organisation is. And so we look at a number of different elements. So leadership commitment is one, recruitment is another, retention levels are another, and engagement. We look at role modelling and how loud it is, to the point we were making earlier about leaders and managers working flexibly. We look at trust, we look at communication, and we analyse those aspects of the culture alongside the data to tell us how possible it is for people to work flexibly. So we gather a number of different kind of qualitative and quantitative data points that can kind of combine to create a picture, because the data on its own doesn't tell the full story, and the stories on their own don't tell the full story. So we do a mixture.
Do you have examples of truly flexible or family friendly, or something that's really innovative that companies have implemented that you think, wow, that was a great policy, or some examples that you would recommend other companies to follow?
Yeah, one that springs to mind is Waits Construction. And I talk about this initiative a lot because it's very relevant to every sector, every team, regardless of the role they do. And I've talked already about our team charter process, and we've adapted that many times in many ways in many different organisations across different sectors. So I won't go over that again, but that is a really great thing to implement in terms of changing the culture and it being a really innovative, personalised way to equip and empower teams to have better conversations about flexibility. But going back to Waits, they implemented the One Simple Thing initiative, and that is where in a team meeting each week, everyone is asked about one simple thing that they could they could incorporate into their working week that would help support their well-being, make them feel valued, and make their working week better. And what they mean by that is one simple thing that you could change to your work week to make it more flexible. So it might be doing a pickup or a drop off. It might be, starting later one day, or, being able to go to a school activity, or being able to go and meet a friend for lunch who's in town, or whatever. So it's not just about families, it's about everyone. And I think that's the key to this, is that going back to pre-COVID, there were a couple of misperceptions around what flexibility was and who it was for, right? And so many people, if you ask them back then what flexible working is and who benefits from it, it means mums that work part-time, right? Now, fast forward post-COVID, and people's assumption when you talk about flexible working is that you mean remote or hybrid working. So it's really interesting to see how those perceptions have evolved. But actually, flexibility means something different to everybody. And I said I'd come back to this. So it feels like a good point to talk about what we mean by flexibility, because it's any change to your conventional a working arrangement. So it could be location, it could be time. It's just, and it can be informal or formal. So Waits have found a really great way of incorporating informal flexibility and making that possible for everyone in their organisation, regardless of whether they're working on a construction site or they're in an office function. And that, I think, is really simple, because any team can do that, and it doesn't impact on productivity. It has a positive benefit on productivity, so it doesn't negatively impact anything. And it's possible for everyone to do that one simple thing. So I really love that initiative. I wish I'd come up with it myself. I think it's brilliant.
And it links back to, you know, your role in your organization, the inclusive workplace, because you talked about how this is not just about working mothers. This is not about any particular group, but it's about making flexibility work for everyone. But if you think, but with that concept of the inclusive workplace, what do you think is, or would you say is best practice or better practice? Is it to say, look at flexibility in a way that it is inclusive for everyone, or to have lots of like 20 different flexible policies and things that cater to 20 different audiences? Is it looking at, you know, lots of different things, or is it looking at something that is flexible enough that applies to everyone?
Yeah, I think that's what we advocate, is very much an approach which works for as many people as possible. And that will traditionally, that will be like a menu of possibilities, some of which will need a change to your contract of employment, and some of which are more informal, and can make work for you in that way. So it's individual circumstances, but also business need taken into consideration. And that's the starting point, is how can we take business need, team need, and individual need into consideration and find a balance of options which fulfill all of those things. So I think what we've found is that if you have obviously the guiding policy, which is usually designed by the HR or people experience team, obviously, and then you have support from internal communications to develop things like key principles, for example, and guidance, which supports managers to interpret that policy and make it work in a way which works for the people within their team. That can work really successfully. So examples of key principles can include things like, as I touched on one, which is that all reasons for working flexibly are equally valid. Another one is that we will all work on strengthening our culture of trust and transparent communication. Another one could be something like, we will commit to measuring performance based on outcomes rather than presenteeism. Taking responsibility personally makes it work. So we are all responsible for making this culture of flexibility work. This is about working differently, not about working less. So it kind of helps to overcome those mindsets around what flexibility means. And the final one that I wanted to share was that we will overcome fear, guilt, and negative assumptions together. So this is a process, and it's about evolving our mindsets and our behaviour. So that's just some examples of the types of key principles that we would advocate incorporating and supporting that policy, because it isn't. Yeah, so we've said it so many times, it isn't one size fits all, but that framework enables people to find a solution which ticks all of those very, very important elements off.
No, thanks for sharing that. I think that's, I'm definitely gonna go back and run over that list that you went through again. So again, we might have to put together a summary of tips that you've given us today.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that sometimes you're speaking to organizations, and it can be frustrating. You've given them reams of research, and could you share a summary of, if you were speaking to an organization and you're telling them about flexible working and inclusive workplace, what are the biggest business benefits of having a flexible and an inclusive workplace?
Yeah, I mean, it brings so many benefits to everyone, leaders included, but everyone within a business. It transforms the employee experience, so it means that work is easier to manage for everybody, and people feel valued as a result of that autonomy that they have. And something that we hear a lot is that people take advantage of flexibility. And I think what we always say is that that's a that's a trust issue, and that's a performance issue. If a individual is taking advantage of flexible working arrangements, then that is a performance issue, and it can be managed in that way. It doesn't mean that we have to abolish flexibility for everybody. So that's the kind of knee-jerk reaction that and a lot of obstacles, that leaders see is the risk, operationally the risk that flexibility will be taken for granted. But for 99% of people, it changes their experience completely and makes them feel valued. It means that they are just, building on that, they're better able to manage the demands of life and career. So that means that they are less stressed, their well-being is better generally, and that supports lower sickness absence. So you notice in flexible organisations that absenteeism levels are generally lower. So that's a huge benefit. It enables organisations also to access more diverse pools of talent. So that increased diversity of thinking and increased diversity among the employee population statistically equates to better organisational performance, but it also means better loyalty, better retention, better culture, better inclusivity, and that that culture change equates to happier employees who are generally more productive, and then the organisation performs better as a result of that. The employer brand as well. If you're able to say, we are a flexible organisation, you are more likely, especially in this candidate market, you're more likely to attract higher quality candidates and encourage better quality talent into your organisation. And then finally, I think it's about fundamentally being heard and trusted as a human. That helps to transform trust and communication within the business more widely, and that means that better outcomes can happen within the business because people have better conversations. They don't just have better conversations about flexible working when you work on this stuff. The benefits then transcend into other areas. So productivity changes because people are able to engage in a different way, just human to human, colleague to colleague. They can have a better experience and better conversations, which transforms projects.
No, that's great. Thanks a lot for sharing that. And I can also confirm with flexibility is something that we've always had at 3R, and even before the pandemic, we've always been fully remote. And I think it's like you said, a lot of it is it's not just about remote working. Because, you have organizations that allow remote working, but then they're monitoring their employees through IT and when people are logging on and all that sort of stuff. Whereas I think flexibility, like you said, is about giving people autonomy and accountability to manage their own time, manage their own work. And, all the benefits that you've mentioned, we've really seen that. And as a small organization, we've never found it difficult to recruit, and we don't use any recruitment agencies. And in the last 5 years, I think we've had just 2 people leave, so we have great retention as well. So I think there's just so much benefit in flexibility. So thanks again for sharing all of your expertise and your tips. How can people get in touch with you if somebody's listening wants to get in touch with you, or get access to some of those research or tips that you've been talking about?
Thank you. Yeah, I'd be very happy to share. So LinkedIn's probably the easiest place. So Ursula Tavender on LinkedIn, co-founder of the Inclusive Workplace and Innovation in Equity, or the Inclusive Workplace website, which is inclusiveworkplace.com or innovationinequity.com.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ursula, again for sharing your expertise. If anyone has any questions that you would like to send in, then we can pass it on to Ursula, and or feel free to connect directly with her on LinkedIn. Thanks again for listening, and we'll speak to you on the next episode of Case of the Mondays. Thanks, everyone.
You've been listening to A Case of the Mondays. Feel free to share this episode with anyone you think might find it useful. Similarly, if you have any questions about what we've discussed today or would like to suggest a topic for future episodes, get in touch by emailing podcast@3r-strategy.com. or head over to 3r-strategy.com to sign up to our mailing list for regular news and updates.